Welcome to Perp Miniatures. I'm going to be kitbashing an Ogryn to use as an Enforcer Sanctioner pattern automata. I started with the Imperial Guard Bulgrin kit, clipping the torso and legs from the sprue and assembling them per the instructions. Then I glued the Bulgrin armor over the torso. I clipped the Ogryn head with a respirator from the Bulgrin sprue, since I want all of my Enforcers to be from the sump and have respirators to guard them from the toxic fumes. I was planning on bulking the armor out a bit, so for now I just attached the head with some sticky tack to test the fit along with the armor. To start bulking out the armor, I clipped the torso piece from the Necromunda Ambot kit and tested the fit against the body and the head. The end of the respirator was sticking out quite a bit and was getting in the way of where I wanted the Ambot armor piece to end up, so I clipped the end of the respirator off the head and scraped that cut smooth. Then, to get the Ambot part to sit a bit closer to the chest of the Ogryn, I clipped this piece on the backside of the Ambot part and scraped that flat. The next issue I ran into was the parts of the Ambot piece that angled up at the end. To try and get this to sit flat, I cut part of the backside with my X-Acto blade, but that didn't fix it entirely, so I ended up carefully bending the piece by hand. I made some other small adjustments to the backside of the Ambot part to help it sit closer to the chest, then glued the part onto the chest with some sprue glue to help fill in any spots that didn't sit right up against each other. I also glued the head in at the same time so I could adjust both parts to sit well together. My plan was to equip this model with a SLHG sledgehammer, which is basically a grenade launcher with a piston-fired ram attached to it. To start this, I clipped the grenade launcher from the Bulgrin kit and glued it to the corresponding arm bit. At this point, I was thinking that since these Enforcers are stationed in the sump, their equipment gets run down and replacements are few and far between, so they need to make a lot of their own modifications. To show this for the weapon, I had the thought that the ram part of the sledgehammer would be an I-beam that was pushed out by pistons attached to the grenade launcher. To make the pistons that would push the I-beam, I took some plasticard tube and cut two pieces at the same length. I had some brass rod that was almost the right size to fit into the plasticard tube, so I drilled out a section of the plasticard tube so I could slot in the brass rod. I ended up not drilling completely through the plasticard, so there was a point where the brass rod wouldn't go any further in, which made making the pistons the same size much easier. I cut the brass rods using a pair of needle nose pliers, making sure that both brass rods were the same size when they were slotted into the plasticard. Then I took a plasticard I-beam and cut a piece a bit wider than the grenade launcher. I carefully drilled holes into the I-beam for the piston ends to fit into. I had a hard time drilling through the center of the beam, so I cut out a slot in the beam with my X-Acto blade after drilling. After I was happy with the fit, I glued all the parts together using some super glue and set that aside. Once that was dry, I glued the assembly to the grenade launcher using some sprue glue. Then, to finalize the position of the arm, I cut a bit of the shoulder off the arm, since the original pose had the Ogryn holding the grenade launcher into the air, which I didn't want. While I was trying to find the best pose for the arm to sit in, I realized that the pistons were a bit too long and would have gotten in the way, so I clipped both of them down a bit to match one another. After doing a bit more scraping of that section, I was happy with the fit and glued it into place using a bit of sprue glue to fill in any gaps. For the other arm, my plan was to keep the heavy shock baton that the Sanctioner Automata is normally equipped with, but again, since these Enforcers have some rundown equipment, I wanted this baton to be more jerry-rigged. While I was looking through my bits, I found this autocannon from the Horus Heresy Contemptor Dreadnought. I thought it would be cool if the Ogryn used this gun as a club after the gun had jammed or become unusable in some way. After cleaning up the autocannon, I cut the magazine off to show even more that the gun was out of commission, then drilled a couple holes in a line where the magazine was. Then I cut out that section of the gun with my X-Acto blade to make the receiver. To fill in the other side of the autocannon that was missing detail, I covered the open space in sprue glue and left that to dry. Next, I took this bit from a Space Marine Devastator squad and cut the plasma gun portion from it, leaving me with only the wire part. I scraped that cut flat and then glued the wire part to the ejection port of the gun club with some sprue glue. To add a bit more of the cobbled together flair to the shock baton, I took some bits from the Munitorum Armored Container kit. In order to fit them onto the shock baton, I had to cut a flat side along the back and also scrape a section of the autocannon flat. I drilled holes for pinning in both parts, and then glued it into place using more sprue goo than is necessary, so that a bit of the sprue goo squeezed out of the sides, which I thought could look like a heavy welding bead where these Munitorum container bits were welded to the autocannon baton. I was happy with how the first one was looking, so I repeated that 3 more times, leaving me with this. Initially, I glued the baton to an arm and hand from the Ogryn kit, but I ended up not liking the position of the arm since it would be too busy with the backpack I was planning on building later. So I cut that arm off the body and removed the arm for the next few steps. I cut the baton at the start of the gun barrel and drilled holes for pinning, then tested the position of the arm. I wasn't happy with how the arm looked, so I was going to have to do some repositioning. I started by cutting the arm around where the elbow would be. After the parts were separated, I scraped both parts mostly flat and drilled holes for pinning. When repositioning arms like this, I do quite a bit of adjusting to make sure the proportions are correct. The main thing to keep in mind with that is that the hand should end roughly at the midpoint of the thigh. Since the initial cut of this arm had the hand end around the knee, I went back and cut the arm parts down a bit more to make it more proportional. Once I was happy with the arm, I cut the hand off to reposition it. To test the whole assembly, I connected all of the arm parts to the baton using some sticky tack. I was pretty happy with how everything was looking, so I started gluing everything together using some sprue goo to fill in some of the gaps between parts. The arm still had some significant gaps, which I'll fill later in the build. Before I glued the arm to the body, I connected the end of the barrel back to the end of the baton where the initial hand position was. To show why this Ogryn is using a gun as a club, I thought I would make the barrel bent out of shape, making it unusable as a gun anymore. So I bent a piece of wire and glued the 2 parts together using some sprue goo to fill in the connection. After all of this assembly dried, I glued the arm to the body using some sprue goo. Then I moved on to make the Ogryn a big backpack, which I imagine the Enforcers use to carry all manner of equipment, and I plan to make a speaker system that the Enforcer Captain could use, which all will be held by the Ogryn. For the frame of the backpack, I took some bits from the Orlok Outrider quad. I cut a lot of the frame away, leaving me with a more manageable sized part. Then I cut a thin sheet of plastic card to the same shape as the frame, and glued it to what would be the inner side. I glued the frame pieces to the back of the Ogryn, lining them up as best I could together. Then I cut 2 more pieces of plastic card sheet to connect both sides of the backpack together, and glued those to the frame. To fill out the frame, I started adding bits that would make it look like the backpack this Ogryn was wearing was some sort of mobile support station. First, I took this screen bit, which I'm unsure of where it comes from, so if you have any idea, please share that in the comments below. Then glued it to this bit from the Manufactorum container kit from earlier. Then I snipped this piece off an Adeptus Mechanicus Guitari backpack and glued it to the side of the console. After that dried for a bit, I glued the assembly to the backpack. I then checked where the screen would be compared to a normal human-sized model, and saw that I glued the parts too high up, so before that dried I shifted it lower. To fill out the bottom of the backpack, and to give the console a few more controls, I took this part from the Enforcer Tauros Venator. After checking the fit, I cut a piece off the back that hung down too low, and glued the piece on. After that, I took this part from the Space Marine Devastator squad, and checked the fit on the backpack. I thought it looked good as a power supply for the Ogryn shock baton, and would connect the wires from this piece to the wires of the baton later. Before gluing this piece to the backpack, I snipped the skull icon off the tank and scraped the area flat with the side of my X-Acto blade. Then I glued the piece on, using some sprue goo to fill in some of the gaps. I wanted to fill up more of the backpack with supplies, so I took a couple backpacks from various models to add pouches and bags to what the Ogryn was carrying. First up was a backpack from the Brokir Iron Master. I cut the techie bit from the bottom side and checked the fit of the bag part on top against the Ogryn's pack. After a bit of scraping along the bottom of the pack, it fit nicely, and I glued it into place behind the head of the Ogryn. The next backpack I used was from the Genestealer called Neophyte Hybrids kit. I also cut this one in half to use the bottom ammo canisters. I imagined this would be something that the other enforcers could come grab ammo from while on patrol, so when I was checking where to put this piece, I took my human scale model again to check what a good height was. Once I was happy with the spot, I glued the piece down with some sprue goo. Then I moved on to the speaker system. I started by cutting a piece of plasticard I-beam. It was bumping into some of the backpack when I tried to slot it into place, so I had to make some adjustments with my X-Acto blade. Once it fit well, I glued it into place using a bit of sprue glue. I also cut a small piece from the quad bike frame and glued that as a sort of brace onto the I-beam. For the speakers themselves, I took these bits from the Skaven Warp Lightning Cannon. I thought they looked good for the front of the speaker, but didn't have anything for the cone shape of the actual speaker, so I mixed together some green stuff in Milliput, then pressed a glob onto the bit and shaped it to a flaring cone shape, repeating the same process for the second speaker. Once both parts dried, I scraped the cone smooth with the side of my X-Acto blade. I didn't like the circular part sticking out of the front of the speaker, so I cut that off with my clippers and replaced it with this part of a bell from an old Skaven clan rat kit. Then, to find the best placement for the speakers, I broke out my sticky tack again, and stuck the speakers to the beam. I decided on one speaker at the very top and the other sticking to the side just below the first. To glue these parts on, I used super glue, and sprinkled on some baking soda. The baking soda activates the super glue almost immediately, but leaves a big chunk of glue behind, which looks bad in most cases, but I think can look like heavy weld lines for this build. After those were glued into place, I drilled a hole in the backside of both speakers and into the side of the communications display on the lower part of the backpack. Then I grabbed some cabling I make by twisting a few pieces of florist wire around itself and cut 2 sections from that. I glued one wire into a speaker, then twisted the wire around the I-beam a few times, then slotted that wire into the holes in the backpack and glued it into place, repeating the same steps for the second speaker. With the majority of the build done, I moved on to filling in the gaps. To start, I wanted to cover the space in the backpack. There was a pretty big void inside, and I didn't want to waste that much green stuff, so I took some tin foil and pressed pieces into the backpack until it was mostly filled out. Then I mixed up some green stuff in Milliput in roughly equal parts and began covering sections of the backpack, then smoothing them out with a sculpting tool. There were also a few sections of the armor that had gaps from where the Ambot chest piece met the armor of the Bullgrin that I wanted to fill. For the shock baton arm, there were some large gaps where I cut the arm apart earlier, so I put some green stuff mixture on that section and did my best to sculpt in some of the muscles to connect both parts a bit better. For part of the model's backstory, I wanted to make a ragdoll on his belt. To do this, I took a bit of green stuff and added in a little bit of plasticine clay to make the sculpting easier. I got the tip to do this from a local at my game store. Her Instagram is at @HeadingInGames. Please go check her sculpts out. I started the doll by making a small sphere of green stuff and pressing it into the belt line of the Ogryn. Then made an even smaller sphere for the head and pressed it on top. Then pulled it forward a bit to look like the head was drooping down. To make the legs, I made 2 small snakes of green stuff and pressed those in. Then, to show how the doll was held in place, I made a thin snake of green stuff to act as a rope and carefully pressed that into the belt line of the Ogryn and around the doll, pressing it into the doll a little, then pressing the rest of the green stuff snake around the backside of the Ogryn. To finish off the main part of the doll, I made the arms using 2 small snakes of green stuff and pressing them into the torso, draping the arms over the rope. I wanted the doll to depict the Emperor of Mankind, so I added a few more pieces to finish off the doll. I started this by adding a small ball to either shoulder. I pressed these in so they stuck, then smoothed them out to a shoulder pad shape, and to make it look like the doll had some sort of armor on. I also added a very small snake of green stuff to the top of the head to represent the laurel wreath that is shown in most artwork of the Emperor. With the doll done, I moved on to some final touches on the armor. First, adding more to the respirator that the Ogryn was wearing. I drilled holes on either side of the respirator on his face, and on one side of the piece sticking out of his armor. I glued a small piece of paperclip into one side of the face hole, so the next bit of green stuff would have something to grab onto. Then pushed a small piece of green stuff over the paperclip, forming that into a rounded triangle shape like a respirator filter. I used my sculpting tool to press in some lines to add to this look as well. For the other side of the respirator, I rolled out a thin snake of green stuff and put it in both holes that I drilled out before, then draped the hose shape to look natural. After some of the green stuff had been drying for a bit, I rolled out a snake until it was about the same size as the wires and tubes coming from the backpack and shock baton. Before I attached the snake, I used my sculpting tool to press lines into the green stuff to look more like it was a big wire. Then, with my sculpting tool, I carefully pressed the green stuff into the wire coming from the backpack, then snaked the wire around the handle of the shock baton, and finally connected the green stuff into the wire coming from that. Then smoothed out both sides of the green stuff to fully connect it to the model. And finally, over here at Perp Miniatures, we believe in personal protective equipment, like ear protection for this Ogryn that has speakers blasting right above his head. So I cut a thin rectangle of green stuff and laid it over the top of the Ogryn's head, reaching to his ears on both sides. Then I pressed a small sphere over both ears and pressed it flat, smoothing out all the edges, then leaving all the green stuff to dry before scraping everything smooth. For the base, I wanted to represent the rough shape of the sump, so I started by laying down a sheet of mosquito netting. I cut a section out and bent it up using some pliers. Then I glued the sheet down to the base using some super glue to get in between all the mesh. I like the look of the mosquito netting, but it's really hard to work with and sheds loose wires if you don't glue that in as well, so I made sure to hit the bent edges with glue to hold everything together. Over the netting, I glued a piece of wall from the Kill Team Chelnath box. After that dried, I clipped the overhanging parts along the edge of the base. Finally, I drilled holes in the feet of the Ogryn in the base for pinning, and glued the model down. With that, the Enforcer Ogryn is done. While I paint the model, I'll be reading out the Ogryn's backstory. The story of Ogryn Enforcer T007Z. Ogryn Enforcer T007Z, or Toots, to his companions, clomped through the sump market. He could see the usual sights of market goers looking to the ground, and some of the further stalls shuttering their doors before the Enforcer patrol neared. Captain Hildrick spoke loudly into the comms device at his side. He heard the voice amplify over the speakers from his backpack.
The cult leader, Father Fecula, is known to be harbored nearby. Anyone assisting in his hiding will be subject to punishment. Information of his whereabouts will be rewarded.
They walked a bit further into the market. The captain repeated his message, but just as he was about to finish, Toots saw something fishy. A couple of the shopkeepers ducked behind their stalls and came back up with shotguns. As they aimed their guns towards the captain, Toots stepped sideways to cover the captain and took the full brunt of the 2 shots. Feeling his armor get peppered by shot, Toots was sent into a daze of light and noise. When he came back to his senses a moment later, the shopkeepers were laying dead behind their stalls, but others with weapons were streaming into the market from all directions. Then Toots heard the captain screaming at him to pull back to the rest of the patrol. Toots hurried to where the others were as they took up firing positions and popped shots off at the cultists. He saw a big cultist about to take a shot behind all his friends, and quickly fired a grenade over their heads. The shot landed a little off kilter, but still threw the cultists off long enough for one of the enforcers to take them out. The squad held their ground while cultists streamed all around them. Smoke canisters then landed nearby and cut off vision from the squad. Toots tried squinting really hard, but the smoke just started to burn his eyes. The captain called for them all to move, and Toots knew that meant he was to go first to shield his friends. So he started marching forward, charging up his baton. He heard a cultist running up through the gloom and swung at the noise, feeling the baton connect and smelling the charred cultist a moment later. Then he saw the gloom start to grow lighter as he neared the edge. Still, he pushed on, feeling the line of enforcers behind him. A few cultists took shots at him as he exited the smoke, but his friends took swift action to send those cultists cowering. Then a cultist pounced from behind a stall nearby and sliced at Toots, barely missing him, but tearing at his best friend, a plushy emperor secured in his belt. Looking down, Toots could see the stuffing flowing out of the emperor's tiny little head, and looked up at the assailant in a dark rage. The cultist, just about to swing their knife once again, looked up at the looming Ogryn before them and made a motion to run away. Before they could turn, though, Toots activated his sledgehammer and caved the head of the cultist in, then continued to hit the switch on the sledgehammer again and again, turning the cultist into a stain across the market ground for what they did. From what sounded like very far away, Toots could hear the captain screaming for him, slowly coming to realize that the captain was right next to him. Toots shook his head to snap out of the rage he found himself in, but could still feel his blood boiling at the loss of his tiny stuffed friend. The captain ordered Toots to lead the patrol back to the precinct fortress, which Toots obeyed and went barreling off, enforcers streaming behind him, soon coming to the armored doors of his home, which opened as sentries saw their arrival. Once inside, the enforcers broke off from one another, Toots wandering after his injured companions, feeling his eyes starting to swell with tears as he took his plushy friend from his belt. Entering the Medicaid room, he looked for the nearest open bed and placed his friend down gently, then grabbed the nearest medic. When they protested his demand, Toots felt his rage flooding back, unknowingly squeezing the medic until they squealed in pain. The medic then followed Toots to the bed and told him they would take care of his friend. Toots had to leave the room when the medic was putting an IV into his friend's arm, as Toots was afraid of needles and felt his emotions swelling up once again. Still worried for his little friend, Toots found himself collapsed to the ground just outside the Medicaid room and let out a deep sob. This commotion cleared the hallway as Toots wailed and slammed his fist against the ground. Eventually tiring himself out, Toots lay on the floor, letting out soft sobs until he felt a hand touching his shoulder. He looked up, seeing the medic that was helping his friend, who nodded to him and reached out his other hand, holding his bandaged plush friend. Toots immediately grabbed his friend and embraced him in a deep hug before standing and bringing the medic into the hug as well. There was a popping noise, and the medic yelped in pain just before Toots let the medic out of his arms. Then the Ogryn bounded down the hallway to his room, making gleeful noises as he continued to hug his plushy friend. Making it to his quarters, Toots squeezed through the door and gently placed his stuffed friend into bed. He tucked him in and whispered,
"Keep tight, buddy. You have to recover before patrol tomorrow."
Then Toots lowered himself to the ground, curled up, and fell asleep. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed your time here, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. See you next time.